So I'll just introduce myself. My name's Lizzie Lunn and I'm Northeast Regional Project Manager for the Northeastern Yorkshire Net Zero Hub, and I'm based at the North of Tyne Combined Authority. And I hope you can see my screen. So I'll just move to the next one. Sorry, bear with me. So on the agenda today, we have myself. I'll give a quick introduction, talk about the hub, and we also have Chris McBride joining us from the Department of Energy and Net Zero, and he will be talking about heat network zoning. Which is where central and local government will work with industry and local stakeholders to identify areas where heat networks are expected to be the lowest cost solution for decarbonising heat. And Chris will also talk about the consultation that DESNZ currently have open. And then we also have a few case studies, so two from the North East region, my colleague Peter Graham from Sunderland City Council. We also have Mark Woodward from Nordic Energy, who's been carrying out work for Sheffield's Heat Network Zone pilot, and also Adam Kerriman from Newcastle City Council, who's also going to talk about Newcastle's experience. And I can't actually see anyone, so if anyone is, if there's anything urgent, please do shout out, because I can't, because of the way the presentation is, I can't see the audience. So just a bit about the Northeastern Yorkshire Net Zero Hub. So we are one of 5 hubs throughout England, which are funded by DESNZ to build local capacity and capability and support local authorities and their stakeholders to develop net zero projects and attract commercial investment. We have a core team that's based at Tees Valley, and then we have regional project managers. And these regional project managers, you'll see on the diagram here, there are 6. Well, they're mainly combined authorities now, or will be becoming combined authorities, and they accelerate and we're working in collaboration to accelerate the transition to net zero and future clean growth through local delivery. You'll notice that north of Tyne, the Northeast LEP isn't on there. We're actually becoming a new combined authority in May, the Northeast Mayoral Combined Authority. And now we also have York and North Yorkshire Local Enterprise Partnership is now the York and North Yorkshire Combined Authority. So what's the hub's objectives? Well, we're here to attract commercial investment into projects and help to develop investment models which accelerate progress to net zero, increase the number, quality and scale of local net zero projects being delivered through the region, develop and support net zero elements to wider programmes and initiatives delivered across England, and support a national knowledge transfer programme to improve information sharing, training and evaluation. And we're also here to raise local awareness of opportunities for benefits of local net zero investment. And I really would encourage you to, if you're working in projects in net zero, to contact the hub, speak to John, who's also on the call, or your regional project manager or myself, and I can put you in touch with the relevant person. A couple of examples of projects and programs that we have. So we have the strategic proposal pipeline, and this is currently open and accepting submissions. So please check out the website for further details about that. This is for proposals for strategic delivery, which we consider will help with net zero projects. An example of one is the geothermal white paper, which was funded with DESNZ, and that we're now looking to how we can accelerate that sector and implement the recommendations. We're also doing work on spatial temporal modelling tools for local area energy planning, and we have commissioned Arup to do a hydrogen roadmap. We've also been active doing projects on local area energy planning, and just to note the community energy work stream that we have as well. It's a programme of support to build the community energy sector and identify solutions for local authorities. We have just employed a new community energy officer as well. So if you have a community energy project, please get in touch and we can put you in touch with Susan. And we have this programme also includes the Community Energy Fund, which reopens for applications in early March. Just a quick bit about the North East, the devolution. So the North East Mayoral Combined Authority will be created in May this year. The North East has agreed a devolution deal which transfers new powers and a 1.4 billion investment fund over 30 years, result of strong collaboration and regional working It's a really good opportunity to strengthen business, community and place collaboration and voice. And there'll be a new mayor elected in 2024, and it will include the integration of the North East LEP. Heat networks in the North East. So we are doing a lot of work on heat networks in the North East. Presently, there's around 9% of UK heat networks located here. The North East and Tees Valley were successful in the government's High Potential Opportunity Programme to drive direct inward investment. We're doing a lot of work around partnership working for cluster development. We've commissioned a number of studies looking at what looking at North East heat network supply chain and skills. And we're doing quite a lot of work to map the pipeline. We're keen to understand what the opportunity is. And we're also participating in a mentoring programme with the Danish Embassy. This slide just demonstrates some of the work that has been going on. So capital value, it shows the capital value of projects at each stage of development. And this doesn't include projects identified through the heat network zoning pilot. So it just shows that there's even more opportunity there for heat networks and businesses. I think I'll wrap up there because I'm aware we don't have much more time. But if you do have any questions, I've kind of rattled through about what's going on in heat networks in the North East or about any of the hubs programs, I would encourage you to get in touch. So without further ado, I will pass you on to Chris McBride, who's going to talk to you about the heat network zoning consultation.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Hi, everyone. I am just going to share some slides. So if someone can give me a nod when they can see this.
It's a bit disconcerting when you can't see the audience when you're delivering it.
Yeah,
but yes, we can see the slides.
Excellent. Right. So, oh, sorry, my computer's going slightly. Right, there we go. So, firstly, good morning, and thank you for inviting me today. As Elizabeth said, I'm going to be talking about heat network zoning and a zoning consultation that is currently live. I believe I've got 20 minutes, which should be enough time. But if I go over, Elizabeth, John, do nudge me, and I will rattle through the last bit. So I guess I'm going to make an assumption that everyone on this call kind of knows what we're talking about when we're talking about heat networks, but like zoning is the bit that we need to kind of fill the gaps in on. And I guess it's important before we start just to, I guess, set the context, which Elizabeth did a good job of starting just then, is that when we're talking about heating is responsible for about like 20% of the UK's greenhouse gas emissions. So meeting our legally binding net zero targets will require decarbonising virtually all heat and building. So it's something that everyone is going to need to consider at one point or another. And heat networks are an essential part of delivering that, especially in kind of urban areas, but not necessarily exclusively. So zoning is kind of one of the main levers that we've got to kind of accelerate the growth of heat networks. At the moment, probably provide about 3% of heat, and we want to get that up to about kind of 20% in total. But I guess the first thing to say about zoning is that no one actually has to do anything now, with the exception of replying to the consultation if you have the time and would like to. Our ambition is to introduce zoning by 2025. This is about getting ready for zoning and thinking about what it might mean for you and your kind of local organisations, your authorities, neighbours, organisations within your areas. So hopefully this provides a good kind of introduction to what it is we're trying to do through zoning. But then also more specifically on the consultation, if there are things within the consultation that you would particularly like to respond to. So I guess the thing to say about zoning is that it will transform how heat networks are developed in England, and this is an England-only policy, which I guess is not of huge relevance to everyone on this call, but just to say this, we're just talking about England, and the consultation is just relevant to England. And fundamentally, zoning aims to mitigate existing risks related to building and operating heat networks, and you can pretty much break those up into 3 boxes. So the first one is it's difficult to kind of make decisions about where to build heat networks in the first place. So the aim of zoning is to designate areas where heat networks are expected to provide that lowest cost, low carbon heat. So this provides then everyone within that area much greater certainty that heat networks are the best choice for decarbonising heating there. That might be if you're a building owner within that zone, if you're the local authority, which the zone is within, if you're a developer who's looking if you're looking to develop a zone. It's basically trying to give that much greater clarity to everyone involved. Secondly, there's some uncertainty about kind of the roles and responsibilities of different organisations in developing heat networks. And again, zoning aims to bring kind of greater clarity on those roles and responsibilities. And that's both at a national and a local level. So hopefully that can kind of allow for better long-term planning, better coordination, and a faster rollout, and hopefully lower costs for everyone. And then finally, there's uncertainty about whether buildings will actually connect to heat networks. You could, design the most brilliantly connected heat network that kind of is mapped out in the most strategic way. But if there's uncertainty about whether buildings are actually going to connect or not, this can obviously hamper investment. It can mean that maybe the network isn't built out to that plan. So zoning can actually require certain types of buildings to connect to a heat network where it's cost effective for them to do so. And I'll go into this in more detail at the back end of the presentation. But by requiring those connections, we're hoping it can help to kind of unlock those scale and new opportunities, but also give that kind of that balance. As I said, it's about where it's kind of cost effective for buildings to do so. So hopefully taken together, all of those things should help kind of reduce the barriers that currently exist to kind of developing heat networks. So in terms of how we're delivering zoning, last year, the Energy Bill became the Energy Act, and there were 2 big heat network measures within that bill. The first one was on consumer protection. So through the Energy Act, Ofgem are going to be appointed as the heat network regulator. And from 2025, they're going to be able to step in on disproportionate pricing, bad customer service, poor reliability. And last year, we consulted on like the finer detail of those proposals, and we'll be publishing our response to that later this year. So this is a whole new generation, essentially, of heat network regulation and consumer protection. What we're currently consulting on is the finer detail of zoning. So zoning was the other thing that was in the Energy Act, and that was like the powers to make zoning a reality. This consultation is again about that finer detail. What does zoning actually look like in reality? And in terms of how it will be delivered on the ground, zoning is going to be overseen by kind of 2 new types of bodies. So on one hand, there is some national coordination that is obviously required. So we're proposing the creation of this central authority that, to begin with, will be in the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero. But then there will also be zone coordinators who will be kind of in different parts of the country who are basically taking forward that local delivery. And again, I'm going to touch on that in slightly more detail. But this is really about what we're trying to do is kind of give local areas and local communities kind of the power and the ability to kind of make the decisions about what is right to be delivered in their areas. So in terms of where the zones will be, the heat network zone pilot was mentioned briefly, but the zones are going to be identified through this national mapping exercise, which the pilot has been involved in, that does identify where those heat networks are expected to be the lowest cost low carbon technology. So the point of the zone is to kind of identify these potential zones that can then be refined through the local process led by those local zoning coordinators, where you can kind of like local consultation, take account of local factors and different things that a national model may not be able to take aware of. So either you can then actually like designate a final zone. So one way of looking at this is that the national model kind of creates a map drawn in pencil, and then the local zoning coordinators through the designation process draw around it in pen or slightly change it in pen. So we'll be looking to produce kind of a digital service as well to show where those zones are. And then another part of zoning as well is having, I guess, better standardised routes and processes for developing heat networks within zones. So again, there are multiple ways in which networks can be brought forward at the moment, whether that's through joint ventures, kind of wholly owned local authority, delivery, concessions, different types of models that, again, we hope through zoning to basically settle onto a smaller number of models, I should say, to help reduce that complexity, make it simpler for everyone, and again, kind of drive down those costs. And we're also working on a number of kind of early pilots and activity, which I imagine at the back end of the other presentations are going to touch on, where we want to see some of these kind of new networks and zones in construction as early as possible. Now, I mentioned the map, the national model. This map is in the back of the consultation, and this is a kind of an early run of the national model. As Elizabeth said, we've been working with 28 towns and cities through this heat network zoning pilot to kind of refine this model, test how it works. And this is, this is the pencil map. So the national zoning model identifies these potential heat network zones on this map. They're the areas in orange. And these are the areas where we expect heat networks to be the lowest cost, low carbon heating option. And this is set against a suitable counterfactual, which in most cases is an air source heat pump. And the model uses data from about size of buildings, building type, energy use, and this kind of initial run kind of shows where those areas are going to be. Kind of, as I said, it's indicative, it's not finalised, but hopefully it shows where, gives a decent idea of where we expect the zones to be, and then the final model, which we will kind of release ahead of all of the regulations going live, will go through, an appropriate quality assurance process, because we want everyone to have confidence in this model, to understand how it comes to the kind of the conclusions that it does. So then when it goes to that kind of local refinement section, there's kind of confidence in what it's doing, and that local refinement process can be as effective as possible. So I mentioned the consultation. We're consulting right now on this finer detail. We consulted back in 2021, that people might remember if they were working on this then, and that was on kind of the general principles of zoning that fed into what became the Energy Act. This consultation is about those finer details that it's going to feed into the secondary legislation and the regulations that we're going to need to introduce to Parliament this year. So again, it's that opportunity to shape those final proposals. The consultation closes in 2 weeks on the 26th of February. So if you have not already engaged with it, please do. I would say there's a lot in it, because obviously there is a lot that needs to be covered. Zoning is kind of a complex, it's a complex area. So the zoning consultation gets into, as I said, the zoning bodies, requirements in zones that are on buildings, on heat sources, how zones are delivered, how they're designated. And I'm not going to run through this all because we do not have time. But I am just going to touch on 2 areas, which are the zoning bodies and the requirements in zones that can be placed on buildings, because I think they're probably the most relevant for everyone here, and also the things that we can kind of cover in the most time. So we'll start with the zoning bodies. So obviously zoning needs to be kind of carefully managed for a number of different reasons. Firstly, we kind of need to give everyone involved notice so that they can kind of plan for what it is that for how they may be affected, again, whether they're a building owner, a local authority, whether they're a developer. We also want to give the supply chain notice and help them better understand kind of the scale of the opportunity and the projects that are coming down the line. Not dissimilar to the map, the graph that Elizabeth shared earlier on, showing the projects at the different stages of the process. We want to be able to do that at a national level, so people can really understand the scale of the opportunity. And the same when it comes to investors, need to give people a better idea of the kind of how opportunities will come to market and what they will look like. So there are basically going to be 2 bodies created to help this happen, as I mentioned earlier on. So the first is this central authority. This is a national body coordinating zoning across England. So they will lead on the development of the methodology and identifying those potential zones at a national level. They'll also look to produce a kind of a pipeline of opportunities looking up to like 10, 15 years ahead, again, giving people that longer term clarity about kind of what the direction of travel is and what projects are expected to come through to market. This is about long-term infrastructure development. They'll also be responsible for developing those standardized routes to market, overseeing local zoning coordinators, directing them, advising them, intervening where necessary, and also kind of monitoring the national progress against that pipeline. And where possible, the national, or where necessary, I should say, the zoning coordinator can hear appeals against zoning coordinator decisions where the zoning coordinator might have made decisions about requirements in buildings. For instance, there needs to be a kind of a point for people to say, well, actually, I disagree with that decision. zone coordinators, on the other hand, as I said, like the local level delivery. So they'll be responsible for delivering heat networks and delivering heat network zoning at a local level. So that will be kind of, those roles will involve collecting that local data to refine the zones, consulting, and then kind of leading that designation process. So again, going around the zone in the marker pen. They'll also be responsible for what we're calling developing a zonal market prospectus. So once that zone has been designated, that's about kind of creating a prospectus to actually advertise the opportunity, to say what the opportunity actually exists and what the kind of the scale of the scale of the opportunity is, to be able to take that to developers. They'll then be able to coordinate that process for appointing the delivery partner, and then they'll be responsible for kind of collecting and reporting on data. Now, I guess we know that heat network zones will not and cannot be restricted to existing local government borders. Like, the model is not intended to just stop when you reach a local government border, and this is a model that needs to work in London, where you've got local authorities who, it literally depends on one half of the street to the other, and also in more rural areas and in more more suburban areas. So we're not kind of restricting zones to local government borders, but also recognise that there may need to be a process to work out like who the most appropriate zoning coordinators can be, depending on what the zone looks like. So, and one of the reasons that we're doing events like this is to start kind of showing like what the potential is, and for people to start thinking about, well, who would the zone coordinators be in this area, and what the right mix is. So if a zone is likely to cover these kind of multiple areas, the central authority can ask them to kind of nominate that lead authority. The central authority can also act as a backstop if no one wants to become a zoning coordinator, or is no kind of appropriate body. So we are what we're hoping to do is to make sure that the right local government bodies can be involved in this, and it might be that different levels of local government lead on like different parts of the zoning coordinator role. Again, there's not going to be a kind of a one-size-fits-all here. It's going to depend on the organisations that are involved and on what the scale of the opportunity looks like. And again, all of this is in the consultation about like the right ways of bringing this forward. So we very much welcome your views and your input on this. How much time? Pretty good. I think we've still got 5 minutes. Now, as I said, what a zone coordinator might look like is in the consultation, and yeah, so we obviously welcome views on that. And it'll be a team closely linked to local government. It might be within local government. There might be a totally separate legal entity, but we will be consulting on the kind of the principles for how it should operate. So the independence, the local democratic accountability, having that input from local stakeholders, having some element of kind of zoning and heat network expertise. So please do use the consultation to kind of come back on those points if they're particularly important to you. And then obviously from a funding perspective, we know that funding is going to need to be required for this, and so funding will be provided from central government so that local government can carry out the zoning coordinator roles effectively. Again, we're consulting on what those funding options should be, whether that's kind of central government funding, whether that comes from kind of levies in certain places. But I guess it's important to kind of stress that this is not expected to be kind of met from within existing local government budgets. We are more than aware of this, and we're consulting on funding options for what it should look like. Moving on to the requirements in buildings. The requirements in zones on buildings. So this is obviously an important part of zoning. So I'll just touch on kind of what we expect it to look like and what we're proposing. So within the consultation, we're proposing that only certain types of buildings can be required to a heat network, can be required to connect to a heat network. What I should say is that what is not in scope of the requirement is single individual family level homes with individual heating solutions. They are not in scope of the consultation. They will not be required to connect. What we're talking about with the requirement to connect are new buildings that are receive planning permission once a zone has been designated, existing communally heated buildings within zones, and non-domestic buildings which exceed a certain size threshold. So those are kind of, I guess, the three classifications of buildings, and we're consulting on that size threshold, again, to kind of make sure that it's the right way, because there's a number of different ways that you can do that. So we're consulting on what that size threshold should be. Now, new buildings which do not connect can be required to be heat network ready to make a kind of a later connection easier. And again, we're consulting on what heat network ready actually means and what that looks like in reality. And in terms of, I guess, the timeline of when buildings can be asked to connect, there is obviously you will not be required to connect unless there's kind of a heat network to connect to. So again, in the consultation, it sets out a kind of a timeline of when that requirement can be activated, what that process is then for negotiations between kind of the buildings and the developer about the connection, what the kind of the buffer period might be in which kind of further information can be sought or an appeal might be set out. But we want to kind of make sure that that is a process that that works for everyone. And again, we're consulting on what that period should look like and how that connection date can be agreed. Now, obviously, within this process, buildings can seek exemptions to connect. So there are kind of a number of different types of exemptions, and I guess all exemptions will have an end date, and they will either be kind of temporary, so they'll have kind of a specified end date, or they'll be kind of conditional, where there is the exemption exists until a condition changes. So these exemptions can be granted for either kind of cost or timing reasons. So, for example, if the connection is if the building owner deems that the connection is too expensive, then that could be a potential exemption. If there is a kind of an existing contract in place that means the connection wouldn't work for timing reasons, that's another reason exemption might be sought. And again, some buildings might receive automatic exemptions from the central authority, and again, those are likely more than anything to be for kind of national security reasons. But again, all of the kind of the finer detail of the exemptions, which again don't necessarily have time to get into now, I'll set out in the consultation. So I appreciate that was a very quick run through for what is quite a large topic with quite a lot of detail, but hopefully it kind of sets the context for what we're trying to do through heat network zoning. And again, I would stress the consultation is live right now. It closes on the 26th of February. If you would like to respond to it and you are able to, then please do not feel you have to answer every single question in the consultation. If there are just some areas of it that you think are particularly helpful to apply to, please just respond to those. But all responses are very welcome and incredibly helpful, so we can make sure that these proposals are effective as possible. And I think that's my time.
That's great. Thanks so much, Chris. We do have a couple of questions in the chat, but what I'll do just in the interest of time is if we've got time at the end, we'll respond. If not, then we can get an answer afterwards and circulate the response afterwards, if that's all right, Chris.
Yeah, happy to come back on writing in any questions if we don't have time. There's no problem at all. That's
great. And are you happy to circulate the slides as well afterwards? Brilliant. Okay, great. Thank you so much. So now I'm going to bring in Peter Graham from Sunderland City Council, who's going to talk about their experience with the pilot and what they've been doing around heat networks.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Lizzie. I'm going to try presenting Teams if it will work. If not, we'll defer to not being able to see everyone. Let us know when they're coming through.
Yeah, that's up now, Graham. Peter, sorry.
Okay?
Yeah.
Awesome. I made it so I can read them as well. Might help. Yeah, so I'll skim through this because a lot of it probably covered and people know. So heat network zone was obviously announced to be delivered by 2025 in the Energy White Paper, and the primary legislation now exists within the Energy Act as of October last year, and secondary legislation is what we've just been talking about there for the consultation. So definition, basically the lowest cost means of providing decarbonised heat. And we've been one of 28 cities working with DESNZ and our appointed zone and technical consultants during sort of 2022 and 2023, as various work packages were added onto that. So in parallel to those 28, there's also been some zone and modelling consultants developing a computer model to try and emulate similar to the manual trawl and sort of quite heavy engagement exercise that we've been undertaking. And that's sort of what we believe is the intention, to take that forward as the initial sort of pencil outlines. So the idea was to sort of develop and test a model where we can identify zones, test the methodology for that. So through this, we've been revisiting and sort of at what point do you draw a definition on a building, and how much sort of leeway do you need to leave on initial model runs, and comparing that with actual data, which can be a bit more difficult to get hold of than you first think, and then sort of using local authority knowledge to understand how areas might develop out, so through development plans or anything like that, and sort of use of buildings, because initial computer trawls might show up a large scale building as having a significant heat demand, where with local knowledge or use of that building, that might prove otherwise. So our zone and technical consultants appointed by DESNZ was WSP. So they also were supporting us and continue to support us on Sunderland City Centre Heat Network, which is now sort of as Sunderland Central, as a result of the outputs through this work. So they managed to support us in getting Green Heat Network's transition scheme funding for commercialisation and pilot boreholes. For various reasons I'm not going to, we still haven't drilled the boreholes, but most of that's just down to cost and the depth we're going to. But that's a work in progress and discussions with DESNZ and various bits of market testing ongoing. So the bit you're probably more interested in today is around the approach we took to the heat network zone and pilot. So the approach with WSP was very much sort of a GIS model based. And as was just touched on earlier, it didn't just stop at the boundary. We kind of did administrative boundary plus, because there are some development areas that would cut across that. And we've spoken to neighbouring local authorities, and they've had some insight as to what those zones might look like, where they're touching the boundaries. So there was initial thermos output, and the level which we drew for that was sort of an assessment at 80 megawatt hours, just to give a little bit of leeway. What's been discussed within zone is sort of 100 megawatt hours plus would be the sort of mandated load for public sector buildings, any communal buildings, and then we also added in large scale development areas into that. Thermos is sort of a free to use open source heat assessment tool that's out there if anyone's interested in having a look at that. So we also took into account the previous heat network study energy data that we'd managed to obtain, where we had actually some actual data from multiple anchor loads within the city. We utilized some display energy certificates to try and get an idea of what was out there. Any energy data we had. So we also run energy contracts from a number of schools, not just local authority schools, but some academies, and also the fire authority. We reached out to the Housing Association for their energy data, for communal heated buildings across the city. So largest being Gen 2, and then some of the other smaller housing associations as well. Government separately were putting in any energy data they had from government buildings within the city. And then the harder part of it starts with website development for a survey. We looped in our business investment team, who have contacts across the city with various businesses and stakeholders, just to try and get as much outreach as we possibly could. We had direct engagement with any major industry. There was national engagement with major retailers or national chains. What's that? And then for any which we didn't have any contacts with through any of those sources, there was then a mail shot to those premises. That's it. There was separately then looking at the heat loads and heat sources, we had direct engagement with those or whatever we could find within the boundary. And then those major loads, let's say, was direct engagement. Any sort of large loads, so what would be theoretically mandatable but not a significant load, we tried to direct them to the website to fill out an online survey. Once we'd gone through that, which was probably getting on for 6 months worth of engagement from start to finish, and there was review and refinement of the data and the building loads that we had across that, and then made an assessment of the heat density and refined where we thought zones might be. So on the engagement, we went out and identified circa 700 premises. Some of them would be operators who might have had multiple premises within the city. So leisure centres, for instance, as one example, housing association, high rises as another. We identified sort of around 50 that needed sort of an engagement and interview at that stage. So that they were the sort of more significant loads. There was, of the remaining premises, there was sort of 150 where we as a council had a relationship or contact, and we sort of engaged with them via email and directed them to the website to complete the survey. And then there was around 500 where we ended up going out just simply with a mail shot. So the direct engagement side of it was a bit more successful. So that was we managed to engage with 20 direct contacts on that, but again, a number of those had multiple premises within the city, so it covered a decent proportion of those major loads. The 98 we had 98 responses via the website. The usability of that data varied vastly, and I think it was quite telling that some who had energy managers who knew what they were filling out were able to provide that data. Beyond
Peter,
that, it was
we've got
quite simple.
one minute left. Sorry.
Right, sorry.
Thanks.
Oh,
Sorry.
Next one. All in sort of output summary for Sunderland, we ended up with sort of 16 individual identified zones, some which could come into a separate, could be combined across road networks. Around 630 mandated connections. I think all in buildings, if they were to connect, that covers sort of 17,000 individual buildings if they were looking to connect later. And then the loads there kind of speak for themselves, as do the CapEx figures, which obviously we wouldn't be able to deliver as a local authority. So it definitely requires private investment to deliver at this scale. What we are moving forward with is we're currently looking to market Sunderland Central as a zone ahead of zoning legislation coming in for a network operator to come and work with us to commercialise that. So I'll leave it there for running out of time.
That's great. So sorry, Peter. I
No,
hate
it's
to
all right.
have to do that.
There's a lot.
I think it's really interesting, and I think people will have lots of questions that about it. So maybe a follow-up session at some point. But Mark, if I can bring you in, please.
Sure. Yes. Hello, everybody. I'll get straight on. I'm picking up the threads from both Chris and Peter, and working with Sheffield City Council. So Catherine's on the call. She'll tell me off when I get things wrong a bit later. But a little bit about me. 20 years ago, I did this journey myself, and that's the outcome on the graph on the right. So with ground source heat, and then make my own electricity, 2 wind turbines, solar panels, and so on. So I've been on the journey myself. I understand what it is to find capital and to have the problems of dealing with regulations, etc. And obviously we've won the odd award and so on. I'm going to pick up some general points that really add around what Chris was talking about and the context of all of this, as well as looking at the Sheffield case study. Now, we're all aware that, you know, gas is the dominant factor in the UK on heating, whether it's commercial or domestic. And as Chris was saying, we've got a limited number of heat networks at the moment. When we look at the gas and electricity prices in the UK, look at that comparison. Electricity is 4 times the price of gas. You know, and that fundamentally causes us a big problem. And look at those other countries. It's about level with Sweden. And so when you're doing a business case, I've been doing this for a long time. Any business case you look at, it's they say it doesn't work. So this is why mandation is so important, or required to connect is the new terminology and so on. And as Chris has talked about, the government policy is moving in this direction. This is a revolutionary change, Zoning. People are going to have to connect to a network. This is under a Tory government, remember, that is libertarian in its instincts. And it's moving in this direction. And the Energy Act itself covers an awful lot of territory, as well as heat network zoning. Vitally important. And that's how the Energy Act went through in Parliament, the 3rd reading in September. It was the Labour and Lib Dem did not oppose. So there was, 19 people objected. John Redwood and people who are very much on the libertarian side of the Tories. Otherwise, the rest of the MPs. So this is not going to change with a change of government this year or beginning of next year. This is something for real because everyone's behind it. And looking at, you know, what you can achieve with something like this, you can do whole city scale rollouts. This is a little model that we put together for Sheffield to give a bit of an illustration. It's rather spurious because it's connecting all the mandatable buildings sequentially by ideal target, moving from one to the other, you know, so it's a fanciful idea, but it gives you a bit of an idea of how this could look across at city scale. The graph on the right, linear heat density versus connections coming up. So as the connections go up, the linear heat density goes down, and the linear heat density is the effectively the cost for doing each connection, because obviously it gets less attractive as the further you go in the network in some respects, but of course the further you go, the better it gets in many ways. And I just wanted to do a little bit on what can be achieved, because this is not a fantasy land. In Helsingborg, their network, it's actually about 700 kilometers long now. It uses multiple sources of heat because all you're doing is circulating water pipes. You can make heat from anywhere. The biggest producer of heat for the network is Chimera, who makes sulfuric acid. If you look at our region, we make loads of stuff, and we're still manufacturing. We have lots of waste heat. We're not using it. And Helsingborg's decarbonised itself. It started this 20 years ago, 50 years ago, more than 50 years ago, at the last energy crisis. They were oil dependent, and they've realised that they were in a big hole because of it. You know, we're in the same hole now, and that's, you know, this is what all this is about. And from a public sector, particularly side, that all those assets, the energy assets, are owned by the municipality. And they built those up over the last 50 years. It was actually offered to the market in 2019, because obviously you imagine a local authority with 1.15 billion's worth of assets that it's got to manage from an energy perspective. It makes them a bit scared. However, the community said, hold on a minute, we're not too sure about this. They had a referendum when more than 50% turned out, and 96.4% said, no, you don't. Because their jobs depend upon the network. Their jobs at Chimera, the sulfuric acid factory, and so on. If we're looking at it from an LA perspective, this is really important stuff in terms of, you know, economic growth, regeneration. It's not just about heat networks. So yes, as Chris was talking about, that's where the current market position is, and that's the investment estimation coming in to achieve that. And we're seeing it happening. We're seeing it happening in Sheffield. That a bit of a heads up on that's. We've actually, fortunately, got, rather like Sunderland, we've got actually 2 networks in the city. The red one is from Veolia, started 70 years ago. The black one in the north is based at E.ON, different sources, but both have got expansion plans and then potential for doing, you know, full-scale zoning, zone completing opportunities. And then heat supply, point I was just making. I visited. I'm working on the programme for Sheffield. That's why I know what's going on here with Nordic Energy. We're working partnered with Visvane and Boss on the programme. But we visited steelworks. We visited the Yorkshire water treatment plant. We've got the data. We've got the raw data, as Peter was talking about. Yeah, you've got to get the real stuff. You've got to get out there and find it and build the relationships with people so they trust you with their data to actually add to the opportunity. And coming back to Helsingborg, little case study. Alfa Laval did the heat recovery work on Chimera. It cost 4 million, and they get 2 million worth of heat sales a year. That's a pretty simple payback situation, because this is not simple. Who's going to pay for the connection for those who's going to put the heat exchangers in for the heat supply people, those opportunities? That's what the steel people say to me in Sheffield. Yeah, it's all very well, you know, and industrial Innovate UK and so on, things like that, Industrial Energy Transformation Fund. But, you know, really, you know, big expenditure, but look at the opportunity, and it's a virtuous circle, all of that. And then supply chain. Yeah, we make lots of stuff as well. We're not just sources of manufacturing. We make lots of stuff. What about the opportunity for integrating those? We're doing city scale mapping as Nordic Energy. I'm just going to end the show and just show you something quickly. And this is a map that the visualization 3D interactive map of Sheffield, just coming back out. This is actually the Veolia network. So you can see the network pipes and the connections in there. And then if we whiz down and then I flick on the mandatable buildings, whoa, there they go. And then, of course, you can, you know, pivot this so that you can see the city. And what we've done is we've put estimated revenue values for all the buildings in all the mandatable buildings in Sheffield using our 3D interactive. This is bespoke. We're kind of leading the line a little bit on visualization work. So the department are pretty keen on what we're doing at the minute on this, because obviously it's compared to a GIS map, it gives you a lot of extra information, and you can work across the, you know, you can just search across the city. It's a little slow on Teams, I'm afraid, but you know, this is all web-based, so it's not special software or anything. You can just, piece of cake, you can sort of use it. So it gives you a chance to quickly see across, you know, what you're looking at. There's a new development there, that's West Bar, and you can see there, well, they've actually got to the top of those towers there. There's the lift towers, and that's, you know, on its way to being developed. So a little bit of a heads up on, you know, the reality is what can be achieved and the background and why I'm so enthusiastic about it.
Thanks very much, Mark. That's great. Adam, if we can bring you in, please.
Yeah, that's fine. I think Mark has probably covered some of the stuff that I was going to cover as well as Peter, so I'll try and avoid some duplication. I've got a couple of slides from previous presentations that I gave that I'll recycle for this particular occasion. So I'll just share my screen. 2 seconds. Is that visible?
Yes.
Yeah, that's fine. All right, so I'm not going to bore you with what a heat network is. We all know what it is, and we all know where we're at with heat networks. So currently, it's 2% of UK heating is estimated to be provided from a heat network, and the Committee for Climate Change estimates that needs to upscale to 10% by 2030 and 20% by 2050 if net zero is going to be achieved. As Mark stated, that would require an investment of somewhere in between 60 to 80 billion. And the reality is that 60 to 80 billion is more like 160 billion when you factor in what it is in real terms in inflation by the time you get to 2050. So in today's money, it's probably 80 million, but it'll probably double that by the end of 2050. We've participated in the advanced zoning pilot scheme, just like Sunderland have. So we've been working with DESNZ and Arup, and they've been looking at the city and modelling our city and establishing ascertaining where the actual heat loads might exist, and which buildings would be deemed mandatable, as in connectable to a heat network where available. This is just a snapshot. The city, Newcastle's, I'm not going to say it's unique, but it's peculiar because it's actually quite a small city, and its heat density is very high. You can walk around town, within 10 or 15 minutes in Newcastle, and within that small footprint, we've got some enormous energy consumers. We've got the Royal Victoria Infirmary, so a hospital that consumes about 80 gigawatt hours per annum, and we've got 3 educational campuses as well: Newcastle University, Northumberland University, and Newcastle City College. So 3 huge users. So there's a lot of heat demand. So it's got a very high heat density, linear heat density, which would make it tailor-made for a heat network. You'd think, and we're discovering actually, because we actually already have heat networks in the city, and we are sort of expanding those networks. What is particularly challenging is digging these pipes in the road, and we're the last person of the party, really, because these roads have been built on over years and are full of services already. So that is a key challenge: is can we get the pipes in the ground, and is there actually adequate space that hasn't been used by other services, gas networks, drainage, high voltage electricity is a nightmare because you need a high separation distance. So we encounter all that. So we're on the ground at the moment building heat networks and operating heat networks. So heat networks is nothing new to the city of Newcastle. We've had a heat network in the city since the 70s, and the most recent one was 2018, which was the Helix. So we've got all this heat demand, all these fantastic buildings that are going to be mandatable. How are we going to deliver it? Obviously, Newcastle City Council is the linchpin of it all. We are the nexus. We fulfil so many functions. We're obviously a major landowner. We have strong relationships with other institutions. We're an anchor load customer ourselves. We've got a huge public builder in estate, and obviously we play a huge role in planning policy and enforcement. And one unique thing with Newcastle City Council is our delivery mechanism for heat networks and how we actually deliver these things. So there is a thing called the Regenerate Partnership, which is a joint venture, a public-private partnership between Newcastle City Council and what was then Equans Urban Energy. They've now changed name. They're going to be called Bring Energy. So they keep changing their name. So the new owners have settled on the new name Bring Energy. So if you hear the name Bring, it's actually Equans, and we are in a partnership with Equans called the Regenerate Partnership. So it's a public-private partnership, and essentially Equans deliver our decarbonisation projects, and we're in agreement now for a 40-year period, up to a total value of 500 million. There's some positives to this relationship because it means we don't have to. We've done all the whole. We don't have to attract a private developer to the city. We've got Equans in place. And Equans have, they don't have a monopoly over the city at all, but what they do have is the right of first refusal for projects that we initiate. So any heat network that the Newcastle City Council plants the seed and starts developing, Equans can come in and have a look at that and sort of have first dibs on it. But there's no reason why a new heat network developer could come into the city and create that competition, which is obviously key to delivering best value for the customer. So we've got Equans on board. They've been in place since 2018, and through Equans we delivered the Helix network. So this was on the site of the former brewery next to St James Park football stadium, and there's an energy centre there now that's built. It's a gas-led system, gas CHP, because in 2018 this was what they were saying was absolutely fine. Obviously the landscape's changed now, and we are looking to decarbonize that heat network, and the first step in that will be installing an air source heat pump in the heat network as part of a planned expansion off the Helix site into Newcastle College campus, and we are doing that via PSDS. So that is the funding mechanism that we're using to provide the funds for this expansion. The Helix network's 10 megawatts in terms of heating capacity. And actually, you find you don't need 10 megawatts of low carbon plant to supply your site. We're finding that we're proposing to put a 1.5 megawatt heat pump in, and that will actually contribute to, you know, I think it's 50 or 60% of the energy demand on site. So, you know, due to the actual heat profile of the site over a year, we can install much low carbon plant than would be required to hit the peaks. The peaks are still going to be met by the installed gas plant. We're not going to retire the equipment that's in there because it's pretty much brand new. And there's also a CHP engine in the energy centre, and the CHP engine generates electricity that we then sell on, as well as the heat, through a private wire agreement. In terms of the work that Arup have done for us, who are our appointed consultant, they've done all the modeling, and this is what they identified through that modeling exercise: a number of cluster networks throughout the city. And then the three that are circled, C2, C4, and C5, were projects that were taken forward into their so-called triage process, where they essentially filtered out projects and then selected a few that they're then going to support through design development through into a Green Heat Network Fund application. And out of the three that were put forward as part of the Newcastle schemes, C2 was selected, which is called the Fourth Yards project. And this just shows you in a bit greater detail the work that Arup have done. So they've done some outline techno-economic modelling to date. Some of these figures are, admittedly, they're going to be heavily caveated because there were a lot of assumptions that were made in the modelling across the pilot scheme. So some of these figures, these aren't to be taken as gospel by any means. They generate a negative IRR, which a lot of heat network projects do without grant funding. But the reality is we don't need much grant funding to actually achieve a 10% IRR. That 10% IRR is something specific to the Regen partnership. So with that's our threshold investment sort of hurdle rate that we need to see before we'll invest in a project. But a project could be 1% IRR, and that's a sufficiently compelling investment case. So on Fourth Yards in particular, we're looking to install low carbon plant, and this is the River Tyne here. And the idea is to install a river source heat pump and extract energy from the river to a energy centre in the Fourth Yards development. And this just shows you the west to east spine, so the main pipework route. And this area here is actually existing buildings. So they've modelled a planned development. Fourth Yards isn't built yet; it's a new development. But this cluster here is existing buildings that would be deemed connectable under mandation. So they've modelled guaranteed loads, but also as potentially future loads as well. And Arup are now taking this work further and are going to do basically a REBA Stage 2 design and an outline business case that would then be put forward into a Green Heat Network Fund application for hopefully to kick works off on site by the end of 2025. So that is our hope, as well as DESNES's. I think my time's almost up, is it, Liz?
Yeah,
So,
that's
right,
brilliant. Thank you so much, Adam.